If you will, go ahead and turn to Joshua 6. I don't preach out of the Old Testament a whole lot, and I'll give you a few minutes to find that. We're going to specifically be in Joshua chapter 6 the majority of the time. And as you're turning there, let me give you a little bit of information. We're going to talk about the account that took place in Jericho. It is an account that the majority of us were taught as a child if we were raised in any type of a church setting. And so there's much that we can learn from this account. It's interesting that it's a story that all of us know, and yet it's not one really that we probably hear preached on all that often. We even hear about it in the chapter of faith there in Hebrews chapter 11, specifically in verse 30. Notice what it says. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. And so it's a great historical account, and as you're still getting there to Joshua chapter 6, let me give you a little bit of information about this city. I'll be honest, I didn't know quite as much about the city until this week as I began to investigate a little bit about it. We know that God had promised to give this great land to His people when they came in there to Canaan. He'd promised specifically Abraham and his descendants. You see this promise, for example, in Genesis 15:7. And He said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. Now you go down quite a bit on down the road, right after Moses has died, and we have Joshua. Joshua is leading the Israelites, and they're literally at the brink of coming in and possessing this land. It had been many years since God had given the promise to them. They still didn't possess it. And no doubt these Israelites who were waiting to come into this promised land were waiting for the many blessings that they had been told about. And they were excited to make this their homeland. We know that they had spent 40 years wandering around in the desert. We know that the nation who had rebelled against God eventually had died in that wilderness. And certainly for those who were the next generation, thinking about this promised land probably really kept them interested and going. Now, as they came into the land, there was a prominent city there. It is an area where all of the different trade routes come in and they join together. And there you have this city, and it stood in the way of them inheriting this land. Now, interestingly enough, most of us, I think, when we hear the account of Jericho, we think of this city being an extremely large city. But as a matter of fact, although the Bible doesn't give us a lot of details, the archaeological digs that have taken place do give us much information. It was a very strategic city in where it was placed. And although it was not large necessarily, it was a decent-sized city in the day, or at that time, it was a heavily fortified city. And so when you got to this city of Jericho, what you would find is it was actually a city that was built up on 3 different plains, okay? And so as you came to the city, there was a first plain, and that first plain was where they had taken the earth and they had mounded it up. In essence, you had a raised, slanted level. Imagine a large city, and there is a slant that comes up. Now this slant would have come up quite a ways, and then on top of that, you then had a stone wall. Okay, that was the second layer. So first you've got a large slant of land. You then have a stone wall on top of it. This stone wall stood, according to archaeologists, about 15 feet tall. Okay, and the stone wall was very thick, so it stood on top of the earth, and then on top of that second wall stood a third wall, and the third wall was made out of mud bricks. That third wall stood somewhere around 20 to 26 feet high. And so as you approached this city, what you had was a large slant, and on that was the 3 different walls, in essence making a top wall of around 45 feet tall, somewhere in that area. Now, because there was the earth and then the stone and then the walls, what you had was on the third level was the actual city. That size of the city was really only about 6 acres large. So it wasn't an extremely large city. Archaeologists figure roughly based on the buildings and so forth at the time, there would have been about 100 people who lived per acre. So roughly they said the city would have contained in the walls about 600 people. There were also, they found dwellings that were made on the base that came up. And so there were people living around the outsides of the walls. And then you had farmers that lived right around the city. And so as the Israelites marched into this city, You would have had the 600 people in the city. Those that lived on the walls, they also would have come into the city. And the farmers, in seeing the Israelites come to take the land, they also would have gone into Jericho for protection. In essence, we would have had somewhere around probably 1,500 to maybe a few thousand people who were in this city. And certainly they wouldn't have been fearful of the Israelites as they began to come in, because the Israelites, although they severely outnumbered those who were in the city of Jericho, it would have been extremely difficult for them to take this city because of the way the city was structured up on top, because of the walls and the height. Now, let me give you a little information there if you're in Joshua chapter 6, because we see that God gave them some instructions on how they were to capture the city. God had already told them that He had given them the city. You'll notice that in Joshua 6:2, if you'll read as I read. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And so He has told them He has already given them the city. We see that the way that it's worded, that it's already their possession. They simply have to go in and take it. This army was to go in and they were to march around this city one time for 6 days. We see that recorded here, Joshua 6:3. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And so each day they would have gone around this city. Although the city was about 6 acres on top, archaeologists tell us that because of the way it was slanted down with the multiple walls, that the circumference of this city would have been about 10 acres. And so it wasn't a large area for the army to go around. But they would have gone around this city as a army one time per day for 6 days. They also, though, would have had priests going with them. The priests would bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns, and they would also take the Ark of the Covenant with them, and they would follow these soldiers. We find this recorded in the very first part of Joshua 6:4. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. We also understand that they were given very specific instructions that as they went around this city for the very first 6 times, they weren't to say a word. They were to be quiet. They weren't to speak. Now certainly, you know, at that time when people would go into battle, often they would scream large or loud cries. Their goal was to make the people fearful. But the Israelites weren't going to do that. They simply were going to walk around quietly around the city one time per day. Notice Joshua 6:10. And Joshua had commanded the people, saying, Ye shall not shout, nor make any noise with your voice, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth until the day I bid you shout. Then shall you shout. Now I want you to imagine for just a second those that were in the city of Jericho. They're looking out over the walls. They see God's people who are quietly walking around the city. How fearful would that seem to you? They're not coming at the walls. They're not making any noise. They're not making gestures. They're just quietly walking around the city. I'm trying to imagine in my mind what the people there in Jericho must have thought to see an army just walking around the city. But that's what they were told to do. We know then, though, on the 7th day, they were going to march around the city 7 times. Okay, Joshua 6:4, the second part of the verse. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. Okay, now after the 7th march around the city on the 7th day, these priests were going to pull out these long horns that they had, and they were going to blow on these horns. And all the people were going to start shouting and screaming and making all types of noise, and simply this, the walls were just going to fall down. That's what they were told. If you were a follower of God, would you have believed that? I see Larry shaking his head, and I believe he would have. You think there would have been any there at the time that would have said, this doesn't quite sound right? Well, notice Joshua 6:5, because this is what they were told to do. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up every man straight before him. So he says, you're simply going to do this 7 times, blow the horns, the walls will fall down, and you will just simply go up and take the city. And he's already promised them that it's theirs. Now, of course, as we read the account here, and for those who were taught this as a child, you know that they did exactly as they were told to do. The walls fell exactly as they were supposed to fall, and we know that they did go in and take the city. Notice Joshua 6:16. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priest blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, shout, for the Lord hath given you the city. Now you go down 4 verses here, Joshua 6:20, and notice. So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets, and it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the walls fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. We actually know that they went in and they destroyed all of the city, just as they were instructed. And you'll recall there was only one group that survived that entire military ascent into the city, and that was Rahab and her household. We'll talk about her in just a few minutes. She was the one who protected those who came to spy out the city. Joshua 6:17. And the city shall be accursed, even it and all that are therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. Now you notice that's what was told to them. Now notice actually the completion of that in Joshua 6:25. And Joshua saved Rahab the harlot alive, and her father's household, and all that she had, and she dwelleth in Israel even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. So here's roughly what we have if I were to summarize it back up. The Israelites came in, they marched around this city one time for 6 days. On the 7th day they went around the city 7 times. They blew the horns as they were told. They shouted and the walls fell down, and they went in and they took the city. Well, what exactly can we learn from this? There's actually a lot of different lessons we could learn from this, although we won't be able to cover them all tonight. Let's understand first that God's ways are not man's ways. Listen to Isaiah 55:8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. A military commander would have never come in to the area there surrounding Jericho and came up with this type of a plan to take the city. It would have never happened. Matter of fact, if you go back and look at Joshua, Joshua was a military commander. If Joshua was to come in by his own accord, not with God's instructions, Joshua would have never said, we're going to walk around the city 6 times quietly and then walk around it 7 times the walls. What he probably would have done was what you saw take place, for example, with Jerusalem. They would have came in with an army and they would have probably tried to starve them out, right? But that's not what Joshua did. And it's because he was thinking the way a man would think. God's ways accomplished exactly the goal that he had in mind, okay? In exactly the time frame that he had in mind. I want you to consider this for a minute. If God's ways worked in the taking of Jericho, shouldn't we consider the fact that God's ways will work today in whatever it is he's wanting to accomplish? And I bring that up because there are a lot of people who begin to question God's instructions. They'll read the Bible and they'll say, you know, that's not how I would have done it, or that doesn't seem to make sense to me. It's just not logical, or it's not the way I like. Well, certainly Joshua, being a military commander, he would have never came in to take the city of Jericho like this. But let's remember, God's ways are always perfect. You know, we see this, for example, today when you begin to talk about things such as baptism, right? People read the instructions, God's instructions on baptism, and for whatever reason, they're not happy with it. I think maybe because they didn't come up with it. And yet, the instructions given to us are very plain. I'm really confused as how anybody could be confused by them. Let me read to you 2 of them. Mark 16:16. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. To me, it's a very clear instruction, not only an instruction, but a specific command on how one can be saved and what happens when one is not. I don't really see the confusion there, but there are many today, I would say the majority of the religious world today, who will refute the idea that baptism is necessary. Listen to Acts 22:16. And now why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And yet people today will say, baptism doesn't wash away sins. Baptism isn't necessary to remove sins. And you can take them to a number of other passages, Acts 2:38, which says it is for the remission of sins. You can take them to 1 Peter 3:21, which says they are saved by baptism. And the list would go on and on and on. My whole point is this. I'm certain that there were people at the time when they took Jericho that didn't think God's instructions make sense. And I know for a fact there are people today who don't think that God's instructions make sense. I want you to also consider the plan on how we are to grow the church. His plan is very workable. We simply need to go out and do what it is that we've been told to do. We're under the Great Commission to go out and to enlarge the church, right? To preach and to teach. It's a very simple command. Now, there's a lot of ways we could try to fill this building up with gimmicks. There are congregations doing that today. That's not how we were told to do it. We understand that the power of salvation is in the gospel, Romans 1:16 and 17. People who are truly looking to be followers of God, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for simply just the plain Bible being taught so that they can understand how to make God happy. And so there's a lot of similarities between how man thinks today and how man thought, even there at the time of the taking of Jericho. And I want you to notice the awesome power of God. Listen to Mark 10:27. And Jesus, looking upon them, saith, With men it is impossible, but not with God. For with God all things are possible. I wonder if there were any in that army who thought it is impossible for us to walk around these walls, not to do anything, not to assault the walls, but to simply walk around them and follow these instructions, and the walls will fall down. I know that certainly there are people today who say, I don't believe that baptism removes one's sins. Well, there can be no doubt that the walls fell by the power of God. And when I say this, I'm going to be somewhat careful. There was nothing that the Israelites could do in and of themselves to knock these walls down just by walking around. And what I mean is them simply walking around these walls didn't do anything to the walls. So when I say that they didn't do anything to knock the walls down, I'm not talking about the fact that they were obedient. I'm saying there's nothing they physically did to these walls. They simply walked around, they blew horns, they shouted, and the walls fell down. Why did the walls fall down? They fell down because of God's power. I was mentioning to John the other night, I watched a documentary on this. These engineers, they were sound engineers and vibration engineers. For any of you who may have been in the military or have ever watched how they walk in unison, military men, when they walk in unison across suspension bridges, if you don't know this, they alter their steps about every other row. And the reason is because if they don't, it actually will cause the bridge to begin to sway and to come apart. Well, these sound engineers and vibration engineers, although it was an interesting video, it was not accurate. They said that what happened was the stomping by the army going around the city caused a vibration. That vibration eventually made the walls fall down. They went on to say that the loud screaming from these soldiers, the audible, the decibels that were coming from them, also played a part in these walls falling down. That's not at all true. That's not what happened. The fact that they were stomping around and the fact that they were screaming did knock those walls down. Those walls were knocked down because these were obedient to God's command, and God did exactly as He promised He would do, and that was to have the walls fall down and then result in a victory. They fell because He unleashed His mighty power. It's that same mighty power we saw during the creation account. The walls fell because you saw His power come out just like during the creation account. You can think of a number of things that took place during the creation account. You think about the solar system being created. You think about our bodies being made. Think about the fact that He even created the souls that we have. And you begin to think about the power of God, the same power that knocked down the walls, and you begin to think about things that even our greatest scientists can't figure out today. An example would be even looking at a bug, looking at how a bug got here, looking at how a bug can reproduce, looking at these bugs that have chemicals in them. The list would go on and on and on. The greatest of all of these creations being our spirit, that which lives on after the body is gone. And so there are a number of things that we can't understand, but simply we do understand that God's power brought them into existence. It's the same power that knocked down these walls when the Israelites were faithful. We also understand that as we talk about this for just a second, we see the relation of grace and faith and obedience. Listen to Hebrews 11:30. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. These Israelite soldiers who were walking around the the city here. They trusted that if they did what God had told them to do, that the walls were going to fall down just as He had promised them. What you actually have is a faith of the Israelites followed by obedience, which resulted in His grace. Now they could have came and sat and talked for a number of hours about how much they believed in God, but if they wouldn't have done what God had told them, it still would have never resulted in their victory or in them taking the city. And so we do understand that they had faith. We know that we today are saved by faith. Listen to Romans 5:1. And therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. I don't think that most Christians today would suggest that anyone is saved apart from faith. As a matter of fact, one of the most popular verses talks about this, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. And so we understand that we have to have faith. The problem with many today is they can't understand how salvation is by faith when they have to go out and do something. Now, I talked a little bit this morning about how God's commands are always conditional. He'll say, if you will, I will. We see that continuously throughout the Old Testament. We find it in the New Testament. And that's exactly what we find here in the taking of Jericho. He told them if they would do something a certain way, He would give them the city. Ask yourselves this. What would have happened if they just decided on the last day to walk around the city one time? Would the walls have fallen down? How about twice? How about 5 times? They couldn't have changed it in any way. How about if they did walk around the city 7 times, but they decided not to blow the horns or to scream? How about if they just blew the horns but decided not to scream? You see, they couldn't change it in any way. That's the point I'm getting to. They had to do exactly as God had told them to do it, and He would bless them exactly as He told them He would bless them. And again, it's not a complicated thing to understand. We find it all throughout the Old Testament, also through the New Testament. And they didn't question His commands. As a matter of fact, they did exactly as He told them to do. And exactly what He said would happen, happened. Likewise, we understand that faith, this kind of faith, saves us, and it moves us to obey God's commands. That's what true faith really is. Listen to Matthew 7, 24 through 29. And then we'll get into the outline I'd slid to. It says, Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man, which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. That's the kind of faith that we have to have as Christians today. Notice he says, And every one that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at His doctrine, for He taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. We taught Him as one having authority because He did have authority. We have a further understanding here in 1 John 2, 3 through 5, as we talk about the kind of faith that we're supposed to have today. It's the kind of faith that was demonstrated by those Israelites as they surrounded Jericho. Notice it says, And hereby we do know that we know Him, if we keep His commandments. You go back to that account at Jericho, that's exactly what they did, right? They kept every one of His commandments. He goes on here in verse 4, He that saith, I know Him, and keepeth not His commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoso keepeth His words, in him verily is the love of God perfected. Hereby know we that we are in Him. To me, it seems a pretty simple thing to understand. I have faith in God, and so I do exactly as God has told me to do, knowing He will bless me, just as we find Him blessing these Israelites in the account at Jericho. And so faith motivates every single thing that we do. And that's really exactly what Paul told the church there in Corinth in 2 Corinthians 5:7. He said, For we walk by faith, not by sight. You think about those who were walking around Jericho. Literally, they were walking by faith, right? That is not the way that you take a city as far as a man takes a city. You don't walk around a city and just expect the walls to fall down. They were walking by faith. This intense longing for heaven, it motivates us to walk that way in life. You know, I find it ironic that you recall the 10 spies that came back and said, we can't take the city. The reason they said they couldn't take the city was because the cities were walled. Numbers 13:28. I find that a little ironic. They thought that the walls were going to stop them. It's interesting, when they did exactly what God did, what God had told them to do, the walls just fell over. We see how little their faith really was. Here's what they didn't understand. God keeps His promises. He has always kept His promises. I want you to hear the actual promise He gave in Joshua 6:2. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho. In essence, He said, it's already yours. I have given it to you. He says, and the king thereof and the mighty men of valor. All of that I've given into your hand already. Now notice the result in Joshua 6:20. So the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets, and it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. That's exactly what God said was going to happen. He said He gave it to them. They did what He told them, and it was theirs. The walls fell because God said they were going to fall. I think it's as simple as that. And God has given us a number of promises. You think about the promises that were given to us today, the establishment of the church. You think about a number of things that encourage us to live faithful. You think about the promise that we have of heaven, and the list would go on and on. His promises, we know, are sure and steadfast. Listen to Hebrews 6:11 through 18. And he talks about this hope that we're to have. And we desire that every one of you do show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope unto the end, that ye be not slothful, but followers of them who through faith and patience inherit the promises. For when God made promise to Abraham, because He could swear by no greater, He sware by Himself, saying, Surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men verily swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is to them an end of all strife, wherein God, willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of His counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things, in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon that hope set before us. How many of you have hope in that refuge that we have set before us? That eternal heaven. God doesn't lie. We know that He's given us a promise. Let me read to you two more passages. Hebrews 10:36, For ye have need of patience, that, after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise. That's an important verse right there when you talk about the people who are going to go to heaven. Notice again, those who have done the will of God. We don't get to choose how we're going to live as Christians, how we'll worship as Christians, and the list would go on and on. Those that do the will of God receive the promise of God. And we know the promise we're striving for is heaven. Colossians 3:24, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. I didn't put this down, but I'd go then to 2 Timothy 4:7 and 8, where he talks about earning a crown of righteousness. Again, an understanding of entering into heaven. And so God has promised us a number of promises. He's further told us He would care for us. Listen to Hebrews 13:5 and 6. Let your conversation, that word means manner of life, be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have. For He has said, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. What's the worst thing that man could do to you? Kill you? But if you're a faithful Christian, what would happen? You're going to go to heaven, aren't you? We don't worry about what man's going to do to us. Listen to Philippians 4:6 through 7. Because we should remember this no matter how bad it gets in life. Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. I know that we all suffer a number of hard things in this life. Physical illnesses, temptations, trials, and the list would go on and on. But we have an understanding, according to Scriptures, that no matter how bad it gets, when we have faith in those promises that were given to us as Christians, we can have peace. Now these two spies, and I'll draw it to a close after this, they show us something else. We've already seen God's promises. I want you to notice these two spies, when they went into the promise, or when they went into Jericho, they had given a promise to Rahab. I want you to notice their conversation with Rahab in Joshua 2, verses 12 through 14. And we'll see the fulfillment of the promise there in Joshua 6. This is part of their conversation with her. Joshua 2, 12 through 14. Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that ye will also show kindness unto my father's house, and give me a true token, and that ye will save alive my father, and my mother, and my brethren, and my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. And the men answered her, Our life for yours, if ye utter not this our business. And it shall be, when the Lord hath given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with thee. You notice again another conditional promise? Yeah, we'll allow your family to all survive if you don't tell anybody that we came in here. Again, they promised they were going to take care of her, okay? In Joshua 2:18, they further went on and said, if you want to stay secure, this is what you're going to have to do, and I'll just summarize it. They call it a scarlet thread, but it's the thread that they lowered themselves down out of a room. So we're talking about a rope here. They said, you're going to hang this scarlet rope out of this window, and that's how we're going to know that this is the house that's protected. Okay? And he said, not only that, you got to bring all your family into this house right here. Because if they're outside this house, their blood's not on our hands. But if they're in this house, we'll protect you. Now notice Joshua 6:21 through 25. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. But Joshua had said unto the two men that had spied out the country, Go into the harlot's house, and bring out thence the woman and all that she hath, as ye swear unto her. And the young men that were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brethren and all that she had, and they brought out all her kindred and left them without the camp of Israel. So they brought them back for protection, okay? And they burnt the city with fire and all that was therein, only the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua saved Rahab the harlot alive, and her father's household and all that she had, and she dwelt in Israel, even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. God's promised us a number of things, but one of the things we also learn is that followers of God, we don't make promises which we don't intend to keep. It's important for us to be people of our word. And certainly that would go in all of the relationships, but especially our promises to God. It's a big promise that we make when we become Christians, that we're going to live faithful and live according to His Word. And so we have an understanding that as followers of God, when we make promise, that's our goal, is to keep it. There are a number of lessons we could have learned as we looked here at the account of Jericho. I hope you've gotten a little more understanding about the city itself and the account that took place, especially about the fact that Jericho would have never fallen had not these Israelites been obedient to exactly what it is that God had told them to do. There are some things involved in the defeat of Jericho. I'll summarize very quickly. We see God's promises first. We then see that God gave them instructions. We then see the faith of the Israelites in action. We see the obedience of the Israelites being carried out. We then see the power of God just as He had promised. And then we see God's reward for their trust and obedience. Listen to Romans 15:4. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. I hope one of the things you've learned as we've looked at this account is that God has always expected us to be obedient to His law. And one of the things that is especially important for us as we draw this to a close is that each person's had an opportunity to hear the gospel. The gospel, very simply, is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, just as was prophesied throughout the Old Testament by the prophets, that we saw come to completion in Acts chapter 2 when the church was established. The Jews that were there on that day and those from the other nations were told that Jesus had been crucified and that He was indeed the Messiah, and they asked, Men and brethren, what shall we do? There in Acts 2, verse 37. And Peter told them to repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. Every conversion account, the gospel is taught, the hearers believe, they repent, they confess, they're baptized by immersion, and they're added to the body. And if you're here and you've not done that, please don't leave without talking to me. If you're here and there's a way that we can assist you in any way, whether it's for me to sit down and study with you, whether it's for the prayers of the congregation or whatever that might be, you can simply come forward as Brother Noah leads us in a song of invitation.